Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Alex Barrios, and I'm with Educational Results Partnership. On behalf of our entire team here at ERP, we are excited to host this webinar today as we present the latest findings of our report, Sharpening the View. In just a few minutes, we'll present the findings, which is the fourth, by the way, in a series of reports that are dedicated to studying foster youth data in the state of California. But first, I want to go over a few housekeeping items, and then we'll introduce today's speakers. First, let's go over today's presentation format. We are going to hear from two speakers who I'll introduce in a moment, and you see them here on your screen. Dr. Lysha Lewis, who's a research analyst at ERP, and Debbie Raucher, who's the Director of Education for John Burton Advocates for Youth. We understand that as our panelists present today, you may have some questions, and I want to encourage you to please ask those questions. You can do so by typing your questions in the chat box, and I will compile those questions as they come in. And then we'll take some time at the end of the presentation to respond to each of your questions. If there's something we're not able to get to today, either because of time or we don't have an immediate answer, we'll make sure to communicate to all of you in a post-webinar email in the next 24 to 48 hours with answers to all your questions. So a little bit about us and ERP. Next slide, please. We are ERP, Educational Results Partnership, a nonprofit organization that applies data science to help improve student outcomes and career readiness throughout the educational system. What we specialize in is linking disparate data sources, essentially what we're doing is connecting the dots, identifying patterns that point to the causes of systemic inequity, uncovering obstacles to achievement, and we work to translate insights into action. We work very closely with data sharing partners to identify practical, effective solutions, and together with our partners, we design strategies that remove barriers to success and open doors to opportunities, with the goal, of course, of creating a more equitable and inclusive society so more people can attain a living wage job and economic success. We're very proud to be partnering on this work with California College Pathways, which has been our dedicated partner in this series of foster youth reports. California College Pathways is a statewide partnership that provides resources and leadership to campuses and community organizations that help foster youth succeed at community colleges and four-year universities. We'd also like to thank those who have supported our work. Next slide, please. These are the organizations you see here on your screen. We are very lucky to have the support of the Stewart Foundation, John Burton Advocates for Youth, Conrad Hilton Foundation, the Cal Wellness Foundation, Pritzker Foster Care Initiative, and of course, the Walter S. Johnson Foundation, which is the funder of the Sharpening the View report. So again, we'd like to thank our funders and supporters for making this work possible. And finally, I want to sincerely thank the hundreds of foster youth practitioners out in the field who participated in this study. We know how busy you are. So many of you are wearing multiple hats in your districts, especially now during COVID. It's an extremely busy time at the district level, and so we want to thank those practitioners who took time out of their busy days to participate and contribute to this study. This study is particularly important because we want to make sure that the resources policymakers are allocating to foster students are making their way to those students. And your voices, the voices of the practitioners on the front lines of this process, are a very valuable contribution to this work, and we look forward to sharing what we found when we spoke to you. If we go to the next slide, we'll provide an overview of the presentation today, and then we'll just get into it. We're going to start today by describing this research series. In case you are not aware of the three other reports that we produced, we'll talk a little bit about those, as well as the background and purpose of this study so that you understand what led up to this report and what was the purpose of why we did this work. Then when we get into the report findings, we'll start with what was covered, the scope of the study, the methodology, the findings, of course, and finally, the actionable recommendations that have come out of this report. I'd like now to introduce our speakers. Dr. Lysha Lewis from ERP. You'll hear from her in a moment. If you can wave Lysha and say hello. She is going to be presenting here in just a moment. She's a research analyst at ERP and played an instrumental role in the development of this report. Dr. Lewis spearheads a number of research projects here at ERP, and you'll be hearing from her in just a moment. Welcome, Dr. Lewis. And Debbie Raucher, we're very proud to have her here. She's been a huge contributor to this report as well and serves as the Director of Education at John Burton Advocates for Youth, also known as JBAY. We're going to hear first from Debbie, and she's going to provide some background on this research series and the purpose of this report. Now, if you're not familiar with JBAY, you should know that JBAY helps foster youth across the state achieve their higher education goals and move on to fulfilling careers. JBAY engages institutions to work together in sharing best practices and advocating for policies that support foster youth in higher education. As the Director of Education at JBAY, Debbie provides leadership and strategic vision for all of their education initiatives, as well as technical assistance trainings and statewide advocacy on behalf of foster youth. She's worked in the social services field for over 20 years, including extensive work in the areas of implementation of extended foster care and developing solutions to homelessness. We're very lucky to have her with us here today. And Debbie, we want to thank you for joining us and welcome to the webinar. Hi, Debbie. Can you hear us? Oh, I think she's on mute at the moment. Let's unmute her.
All right, there we go. Thank you.
There you are. Sorry about that delay.
No worries. Thanks, Alex, and thanks so much for including me in the webinar. So if we can go to the next slide. So I'm going to just share a little bit of background of kind of the research series that has preceded this particular. And I'll just start by saying that, we're so excited to be able to partner with ERP on this work. And over the last 5 years, we've worked with ERP on these 3 reports that you see on the screen. And I just want to kind of emphasize how crucial the research work is to what we do. So we at JBAY are primarily an advocacy organization. And without access to this kind of data and information, we'd be kind of operating blind in a way. And so being able to work with ERP to do this kind of research really helps us to feel confident that the policy work that we're doing is really based in reality and that what we're doing is really going to be effective and make a difference. So just want to say that. The 3 reports that preceded this one. So the first one, Charting the Course in 2015, really showed some of the academic and economic challenges that foster youth face as they try to make their way through college. And we learned in particular in that report about how foster youth are not receiving financial aid that they receive, which has really driven our advocacy work over the past 4 years. Accelerating Success was the second report in the series. And that really, what are the factors that seem to correlate with foster youth college success? So early alert systems were identified as really key. And it kind of gave us the first inkling of evidence that having a foster youth support program on campus also leads to better outcomes for foster youth. The third report, which came out last year in 2019, Pipeline to Success, really started linking up the college data to high school data. And this is really where we started to see what were the factors in that transition point between high school and college that made a difference. And it really kind of pointed to both counseling and financial support as really key in foster youth college success. I'll mention as well that in addition to the research reports, ERP has created a couple of different dashboards that are available to practitioners who work either in a community college or K-12 setting. And the dashboards provide a really just incredibly comprehensive snapshot of all kinds of different factors about how foster youth are doing in community colleges. And then the K-12 dashboard shows what that transition from high school to college looks like. So if you do work in a K or community college setting and you don't yet have access to those dashboards, I'm going to commit Alex to providing some information in the follow-up email about how folks can get access to those. All right, if we want to go to the next slide. So what about this report, though? So, you know, I just mentioned the K-12 to college dashboard, really looking at that transition point. As that dashboard was being created and as work was being done on the previous report, the Pipeline to Success report, you know, there was a number of challenges that ERP came upon and that we recognized as we were moving through that process that really hindered our ability in many ways to get access to the data that was necessary for that report. So we had to do a lot of kind of workarounds and troubleshooting to get access to that information. And the California College Pathways Funders Alliance, in hearing about that, said, you know, it would be really great to document all that. Now that you're sort of seeing this, rather than just recognizing it and moving on, let's take a minute to take a step back and better understand what the challenges are that were emerging from that process. And that really led to the creation of this report. And so the idea here is to both identify the challenges, but then really think about how can we move forward and what kinds of improvements can be made so that this kind of information can be more accessible in the future. So if we go to the next slide. So what ended up being covered in this report, essentially the report sought to answer 3 questions. So first, what are the perceptions that K-12 practitioners have about the quality of foster youth data? So really understanding, you know, what it looks like right now and how it's being perceived. What are the challenges that practitioners experience when trying to obtain quality foster youth data? And how do these challenges then impact their ability to serve foster students? And at the end of the presentation today, we're going to be sharing some recommendations. So how then can those challenges be addressed so that those that any negative impacts on the ability to serve foster students can be addressed? So I'm going to turn it back over to Alex now.
Thank you, Debbie. Appreciate it. And as always, it's a pleasure to work with you and the team to produce these reports. And we are really excited about delving into the findings here. Dr. Lewis, you're going to go ahead and take us through the methodology first so that the audience here understands the process we went through to get to the findings that you'll be presenting today. Welcome, Dr. Lewis.
Thank you, Alex. We're now going to, excuse me. As Alex mentioned, I'm going to share with you the key findings, but first I'm going to provide you with an overview of our methodology. So to understand how K-12 foster youth practitioners perceive quality of foster youth data across California, we conduct an exploratory study that focused on learning about the experiences of practitioners that rely on foster youth data and systems to deliver services. So this study used a mixed methods approach that combined qualitative and quantitative data collection techniques. The first method used was a focus group, which was conducted in fall of 2019. For the second method, we developed a questionnaire, which was emailed to foster youth practitioners across the state in January of this year. And lastly, we conducted in-depth interviews with select practitioners, which was completed in March of this year. There were a combined total of 193 participants for the study. The participants for this study consisted of 2 groups. The first group consisted of educational liaisons at the school district, often referred to as AB 490 liaisons. The second group of participants were foster youth service program coordinators at the County Office of Education. So both of these groups were selected because they serve as the primary points of contact within school districts and County Office of Education who are responsible for serving foster youth per state law and are regular users of the foster youth services reviewed in this study. Both of these groups are also the most valuable source in identifying practical challenges when accessing and using foster youth data, and this is why they were selected as participants for this study. So the survey responses, as well as the interview and focus group transcriptions, were imported into a mixed methods research support software. So using tenets of a thematic coding process, we were able to identify themes in the qualitative data, and a team coding process was adopted to ensure that the data collected within the qualitative study was correctly interpreted by the research team and to safeguard for trustworthiness and quality of the research. So following the qualitative analysis, the quantitative responses were analyzed and descriptive statistics were generated to provide quantitative information on participants and code frequencies for each category and subcategory. Next slide, please. So this iterative process produced 5 key findings, which derived from 6 themes. The 6 themes were identified were recent changes are good, but more is needed. The second theme, there are too many definitions for foster youth. The third, there are too many data systems. The fourth, access to quality foster youth data continues to be a challenge. The fifth theme was data lags negatively impact student services. And the sixth theme was training is needed to improve the understanding and use of foster youth data. As previously mentioned, our study had 3 research questions. I'm now going to walk you through the questions and our findings associated with each question. Next slide. So our first question asks, what perception do K-12 practitioners have about the quality of foster youth data? Next slide, please. So here we found that K-12 foster youth practitioners agree that the recent policy changes helped, such as the local control funding formula, which was the first time foster youth was included as a subgroup in the education accountability framework. Another policy was AB 97, which mandated data sharing between the Department of Social Services and the Department of Education, which enabled local education agencies to have access to information about their foster youth. And so both of these policies are positive steps in the right direction, but we found that more is needed to ensure practitioners can adequately identify foster youth and use data to improve student outcomes. Next slide, please. So in addition to the positive policy changes, K-12 practitioners expressed the current data is helpful, but improvement is needed. The figures you see on your screen show most K-12 practitioners indicated they find the data that is currently available to them is helpful. However, most practitioners also felt there is somewhat of an urgent need or an urgent need to improve foster youth data. Next slide. The study also found that K-12 practitioners identified a number of different benefits to using the current foster youth data. One of the greatest benefits were program development and identification of foster youth. And you see here on your screen that 32% of practitioners identified being able to develop programs as a benefit, and 30% identified being able to identify foster youth as a benefit of the current data. Next slide. Our second research question asks, what challenges do K-12 practitioners experience when trying to obtain quality foster youth data? Thank you. While most practitioners indicated they find the data currently available to them helpful, K-12 practitioners also experience challenges accessing, utilizing, and disseminating foster youth data. In fact, you see 63.2% of practitioners indicated that accessing, utilizing, and disseminating foster youth data is moderate to very challenging. Next slide. So while K-12 practitioners reported many different types of challenges with obtaining quality foster youth data, the most frequent noted barriers, I'm going to go over 5 of them. The first, inferior data quality, which was the most frequent noted barrier. And for example, what we heard from one practitioner at the County Office of Education was that they experienced challenges with having different ways in which school districts collect educational foster youth data. Another barrier was conflicting foster youth definitions. And so practitioners referenced there are several different foster youth definitions, and we will review these definitions in more detail on the next slide. But I'm going to go over the other 3 barriers here. Data lag was another noted barrier. We heard from the field that the lack of timely, accurate information provides challenges to ensuring student access, necessary services, and support. So we know that such errors in the data can lead to confusion and instructional programs for students. And another barrier was inadequate foster youth identification. We heard that there are challenges with understanding the status of foster youth. One example is when a youth return to their family but are in family maintenance and are still considered a foster youth. Considering the youth is no longer in an out-of-home placement causes some confusion about their foster youth status. And lastly, lack of access to information about previous student enrollment was another noted barrier. We heard from one practitioner that when requesting foster youth data through the educational passport system, some districts responded in a timely manner, but others did not. And so this lack of information about previous school enrollment makes it difficult to move forward with making appropriate decisions for their students. And so all of these barriers embodied what the study found in that practitioners have a difficult time trying to obtain data needed to serve their foster students. Next slide. As previously noted, K-12 practitioners expressed the lack of one common working definition for foster youth makes it difficult to easily identify which services students are eligible for. And this is because students who intersect with the child welfare system can do so in a variety of ways. So the table you see on the screen lists and compares the foster youth definitions under various state laws. And so this is one of the major findings of this report. So we're going to spend some time here discussing, and I'm going to ask Debbie to chime in with some more background and commentary. Debbie, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so as you can see from the chart here, we've got these different benefits for foster youth. AB 490, which has to do with school stability rights, AB 167 and AB 216, which has to do with graduation requirements. We've got services that are available through the Foster Youth Services Coordinating Programs, which exist at the County Office of Education. We've got the local control funding formula, which specifies that certain services need to be provided specifically to foster youth. And we have all these different subcategories of foster youth, and some get some things, and others get other things, and it's extremely confusing. And I don't think, I wasn't here for the passage of every single one of these bills, but my sense is that this was not by design. In other words, these different bills passed at different times and they were defined differently, and we sort of ended up with this kind of mishmash of definitions just by default, rather than somebody actually sitting down and saying, this is the way that this should be. It's improved. In 2015, there was a big step taken with the alignment of the FYSCP definition to the LCFF definition. And so, that was a huge shift and allowed students who were under the supervision of the Child Welfare Agency, but were in a family maintenance case, meaning that they were living with a biological parent, to be included in these services. But then as other rights have been added, so in 2018, foster students under the placement of an Indian tribe were added to LCFF, but they were not added to some of the other programs, and students who were in a voluntary placement sort of never really got included in some of these benefits, or only partially So anyway, it creates these inconsistencies and a lot of challenges for practitioners. And I think this was one of the big things that was really revealed, where there's an opportunity for the legislature and policymakers to kind of take a look at aligning some of these. And this would serve two purposes. I mean, number one, it would ensure that the students have all the resources and benefits that they need to be successful. That's the most important reason for the alignment. But secondly, it would also make the lives of practitioners much easier and allow them to not have to spend all this time trying to figure out for any given student, well, you qualify for this, but you don't qualify for that, and you used to qualify for this, but now you don't anymore. And that would allow them to actually focus their time on serving the students rather than having to spend time wading through all of these different definitions and figuring out who gets what. So this was really one of the more significant findings, I would say, from the report. I will just say, as somebody who assisted with putting together this chart, that we went through so many iterations of this trying to get clear who qualified for what. And I can just only imagine what a practitioner who, is trying to serve students at the same time has to go through to figure this out for any given student. So it gave me a lot of empathy personally for this challenge. And I think it was a really valuable finding to really sort of get clear on this. I'll turn it back over to Lysha.
Thank you, Debbie. So shifting gears here, this study also found, oh, excuse me, next slide, please, Lena. Thank you. So this study found that 57% of K-12 practitioners identify the way in which different programs treat foster youth placement status to be the biggest challenge to understanding foster youth definition. So for one example, we heard from a practitioner is that there is confusion about foster youth family maintenance, and there's confusion about probation youth who are not in out-of-home placement, but who do qualify for AB 167 and AB 216. So this is a perfect example of why it's important that there is alignment among the various foster youth definitions. Next slide. The use of multiple data systems is another challenge we found in this study. So K-12 practitioners share that they must leverage multiple complex data systems when trying to meet the needs of foster students. This creates co-located data, which is not as comprehensive or streamlined as fully integrated data. We also found that practitioners in this study identified 13 different data sources to access foster youth data. We heard from one practitioner that they use CalPads, Foster Focus, and the CMS CWS system. They also get information from individual district student information systems such as ARIES. They use Promise for their county office of education, court, and community schools, and they also mine data out of DataQuest. So that's a lot of different data systems being used. Next slide. In echoing the previous practitioner's comments about accessing multiple data systems, this study found that only 9% of practitioners can access student data from one data source, while 65% of practitioners have to use 3 or more sources to access foster youth data. Data systems used by the various agencies that capture information about foster youth do not regularly communicate and share data among each other in real time. So, for example, when a youth moves to a new county, K-12 practitioners are often unable to access that student data from other systems. Next slide. So while there's a student match process between the local education agencies and the Child Welfare Services Case Management System, CWS-CMS, which sends student data to the state's CalPAS system, there are some limitations to the data sharing process across systems. The figure you see on your screen was adapted from a presentation by the California Department of Education and presented at the California Foster Youth Education Task Force earlier this year. And this figure shows some of those limitations. I'm now going to ask Alex to chime in and provide some background about the data systems limitation. Alex, want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Lewis. As Debbie pointed out, there is it's very challenging for practitioners when the definition is not clear, and when you're spending a lot of time just trying to identify what a student is eligible for, rather than being able to just connect them to the services. And so, piggybacking on that challenge, one of the findings of this report was really that CalPAS does not feed data back to local county systems, and that results in important information not making its way to practitioners in the field. So definition is challenging enough, and then on top of that, you're adding that information is not getting to practitioners in the field in a timely manner. And so this just further complicates the job of practitioners, because when a new student enrolls in their district or they find out there's a new foster student, they may not necessarily have all the information they need to provide services at that time. So this one-way data flow does result in some limitations to the data quality that practitioners are receiving, and access, of course, to the timely information that they need. So this is, of course, a challenge. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the recommendation section, but I think this visual helps to highlight in a very simple way what that data sharing challenge is at this point in time. Thank you, Dr. Lewis.
Thank you, Alex. Next slide. Thank you. So moving along, the last challenge discussed in this section looks at the various data element group sets identified by K-12 practitioners. So this study found that a barrier that exists is the clarity about which data element should be collected for different data systems being used. So we found that child welfare case data, education rights holder, and school mobility were the top 3 of the 14 data elements most utilized by K-12 foster youth practitioners. Next slide. Our last research question asked, how do the challenges experienced by K-12 practitioners impact the ability to serve foster students? Next slide. Thank you. So we heard from K-12 practitioners that they do not receive timely data from their foster students. This lag in data results in serious barriers when trying to provide effective supports. And along with this, we found that 34% described the quality of the data as the biggest challenge when foster youth data is lag or inadequate. Ultimately, the lag in data availability impacts student services. Next slide. We also found that foster youth practitioners expressed that additional training is needed to help improve their understanding and use of foster youth data. The figure you see on your screen show 45% of practitioners reference needing additional training on the various foster youth definitions, and 39 reference needing additional training on the use of using the different data systems. So these findings reveal practitioners face significant challenges when trying to obtain quality data that is needed to do their job. And in addition, the study revealed the need for consistent data sharing processes. So this concludes the study findings. I'm now going to turn it over to Alex and Debbie, who are going to walk you through the 3 actionable recommendations aimed to improve K-12 foster youth practitioners' data user experience. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Thank you both for the presentation, and we're going to now transition into the recommendations. I think if there's a way to summarize what we just heard and what we heard from the field, I think we heard it fairly loud and clear through this series of interviews. Too many definitions is kind of one way to describe it, or lack of a common definition. Too many data systems, having to access too many data systems, or having to log into multiple data systems to get the essential information necessary to serve students. That was a common theme in the challenge we heard. And of course, not enough timely information about the students is another theme that we heard. So we heard all these themes and really took those to heart to try to identify what could we do to start improving the way that the data is available to the field, and make it easier for users out in the field to use this data. And so really it starts with policy, and as you saw earlier in the presentation, a common theme in the challenges that we heard was the difficulty in identifying foster students and determining what services they're eligible for. And that really stems from this lack of a workable definition of foster youth in state code. And so the table we presented earlier on slide 20, there were various definitions. And if Alexis, if we could go back to slide 20 and put that up on the screen, I think it'll be helpful to speak to that slide here in the recommendation section. Can we go back to that slide, the table with the, yeah, there we go, thank you. So this is really at the crux, as Debbie pointed out, of the solution here is how do we work to get these definitions to line up in a more workable fashion. And so that's really the first recommendation here, is that we need to start with one workable definition, and then we'll delve into some more detail in the next recommendation on how, what we mean when we say workable and how we start to align systems together. But it starts with this workable definition. And I'd love to have Debbie chime in here and provide a little bit more context and background in terms of why having a workable definition is so important to the field.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to reiterate, I think, what I said earlier, you know, which is that it's so important on multiple levels, both for students getting the resources that they need and for practitioners to really on serving students rather than having to figure out who's eligible for what. And I think that foster youth are already such a small population relative to the larger student population that there's always a risk with foster youth that they're going to fall through the cracks and they're not going to get the services they need because they are such a small population. And when practitioners can't even track or easily understand who's eligible for what, it just exacerbates that risk and makes it all the more likely that somebody's going to fall through a crack and not get the services because it's just so confusing to figure out what kind of placement are they in, and oh, they changed placements, they went from this type to that type, and so does that mean I can no longer serve them anymore? And all the time that you're spending trying to figure out the answer to that question, the student isn't necessarily getting the necessaries, or the records aren't being, or yeah, or key recommendations. I know that in policy alignment and supports that prioritize circles. So you want to say anything further or go on to the next recommendation?
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Yeah, let's go back to recommendation, or let's go back to the end of the presentation here to recommendation number 2. Thank you for that summary. I think it's very important to highlight really what this means on the ground, right, in terms of providing services. So on the second recommendation, I mentioned that we would get into a little bit more detail about how do we make this definition workable. So it starts with policy, getting the policy right, having a workable definition in state code. And then the next step is really to use that information to begin to improve data sharing between school districts and the agencies that are serving foster youth. Now, here at ERP, we have, when we're currently working across the country with various organizations and agencies and government, not just in K-12 and in social services, but in health and criminal justice. And I can tell you that it is very difficult to get collaboration on data sharing, but we are fortunate here in California that we are starting to see some really good collaboration at the agency level with the California Department of Education, California Department of Social Services, and school districts to try to work through some of these data sharing limitations. Now, the big issue here is silos and how the data is organized. So one of our recommendations, once we get a workable definition, is that we have to start to first and foremost coordinate with each other, which is starting to happen. But second, what needs to happen once that collaboration begins is establishing norms. Now, we in table 2 of this report, and you saw it in the slide earlier, identified the most commonly used data elements that foster youth practitioners on the ground are working with. And so if we're going to start anywhere in terms of organizing the data, it's going to be with those 14 data elements and establishing some norms for how we structure that data in the databases that this information goes into. The next step would be to standardize that data and ensuring there's a common data format. We see this all across the country where the format that the data is in doesn't well once it leaves the data system that it's at, so that when we try to share that data between agencies and between silos, they will actually communicate and sync well with each other. That consistent organization is critical. We see it all around the country. This is a tremendous amount of work, but again, with good collaboration, that can happen. Once that data gets organized and structured, the next step is to establish an application program interface, also known as an API, which will allow the data systems, once they begin to share data in a common format, to begin to regularly exchange data. This is where you hear that common term, real-time data sharing. So when one system is updated, the other systems that they are connected to will also get that update. That's going to solve this issue of data lag that a lot of practitioners out in the field mentioned as part of this study and part of the focus groups. We heard this a lot. By the time a student gets to me, by the time I get the data, weeks have gone by and that situation that the student was in no longer applies. The application program interface will allow the information to flow between agencies in as close to real time as possible, meaning that the information that you would get at the time that you see the student is as close to updated as possible. So this is critical. There's of course a lot of legal issues that departments have to work through to make sure that they can actually begin to exchange data like this in real time, but we're confident again that with good collaboration that can happen. And then finally, making sure that we have centralized access at the state level for K-12 practitioners. One of the keys to making this happen is to make sure that, again, all stakeholders are bought into this process, but that also there's that vehicle at the state level where practitioners can log in to ideally what would be their student information system or a system that is connected to CalPads so that they can get access to this information as it updates in the system rather than having to proactively go and get that information themselves. That would make it a lot easier on the front lines when the information that pertains to your student pops up on your screen in your student information system rather than you having to go out to another data system to go get the information. So those are the main recommendations that we are making in this report to improve data sharing. But again, I can't stress the importance of collaboration between partners and agencies to make that happen. The technology is there to do all of this. What is needed is the will at the state level, at the policy making level, at the leadership level to collaborate with each other to make that happen. Is there any other comments from either Dr. Lewis or Debbie on this particular recommendation before we go to our final recommendation?
I'll just say that, I want to make sure we recognize that the work that CDE has done in collaboration with CDSS over the last few years really has been tremendous. So we have come leaps and bounds from where we were just a few years ago in terms of there being data sharing. And that was clearly recognized by practitioners in the report as well, and they acknowledged that. And so, I want to be clear that we've really, there's been tremendous work that's happened. And at the same time, as Alex pointed out, there's still, there's a lot that remains to happen in order for the system to really be truly functional and beneficial to the practitioners in a meaningful way. So we're getting there for sure, and hopefully continue forward on this path and use some of the ideas that Alex just shared to make it even stronger.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. And I completely agree. The collaboration has been great, and the progress being made is tremendous. And so, moving on to our third recommendation, we do really want to encourage practitioners in the field, as well as advocates, if they just want to learn more, to check out some of these resources that have been made available and are available to practitioners out in the field. The CDE has a web page. You can see the link over here, which is some resources. These are two resources that are very important. The other one is for county offices of education. So whether you're a school district practitioner or you're at the county level, there are resources available to you. We've been in contact with the team in the foster youth unit at CDE. They're very much interested in hearing from the field and providing resources to you. And so we encourage you to connect with these resources. I do want to add, to Debbie's point, some of the progress that has been made at the CDE level. For example, and I think we call this out in the report, but if we didn't, I'll mention it here. Back in May of 2019, they research and evaluation consultant whose job is to serve as a dedicated foster youth data liaison, provide foster youth with timely and appropriate supports and services. So this, of course, was created out of an identified need to have a designated foster youth data expert at the department and to support that ongoing collaboration that we talked about. So I think this has really made a significant contribution to these efforts, and we wanted to make you aware of that. This liaison is also working closely with the Department of Social Services on the data match process and data sharing MOUs. And so if you're interested in keeping up to speed on kind of how that work is going, please let us know. There's actually a link that we'll be sharing here in a little bit if you want to get updates on progress that is being made at the state level, or if you want to get involved in advocacy efforts to continue the improvement. We'll share that here with you in just a moment. But again, I want to encourage you to connect with these resources if you're working on the ground in the field. They're here to help. We've been in communication with them. They're very much excited to work with you if you haven't connected with them already. And please do take advantage of these resources that are available. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Debbie to talk a little bit about how you can get involved with JB's advocacy efforts if you'd like to help with the statewide advocacy efforts that are going on. Debbie, please feel free to share a little bit more about your work and how folks on the line can get involved.
Yeah, so if we could go to the next slide. So, and I think, Alex, you're going to post this in the chat as well. We did create a Google form that you can go to and just provide your contact information if you want to keep up to date on our advocacy efforts. So, as folks may be aware, we at JBA primarily a policy advocacy organization, and we sponsor different bills each year. We always do at least a couple of bills related to education, sometimes focused on kind of K-12 transition into college, sometimes more focused on college. We also partner with other organizations who are active in this space as well. And, I think there's going to be some interesting legislative this coming year, maybe even some to very directly address some of the recommendations in this report. And so this is all still evolving. We're kind of at the very beginning of a new legislative cycle, and bills are being introduced over the next month and a half or so. And so if you're interested in just staying up to date specifically about advocacy efforts and knowing what bills are happening and how you can get involved, you can go ahead and fill out that form. Again, it's just asking for your name and email address, essentially. And that way we can make sure that you stay up to date on what's going on as the legislative year rolls forward. So I think back to you, Alex, to see if there's any questions.
Yeah, no, thank you, Debbie. Encourage everybody to sign up to get those updates. We very much look forward to your continued involvement in this work. And thank you, Debbie, again, for spearheading these efforts at the state level. I think it's very important that that someone is advocating for the field. I mean, the field is so busy right now working directly with students and handling a lot of the challenges that are coming. You know, the districts are, it's a very difficult time in school districts right now. I used to work in a school district and know just how difficult it is. And we're very fortunate to have you at the statewide level advocating for this work. So thank you for that. I did see some questions that popped up in the chat. We'll attempt to answer these to the best of our ability. We've got about 5 minutes or so to answer some questions, and we'll do the best we can to get to your questions. The first question was whether these slides will be made available after the presentation. The answer is yes. We will provide you with a slide deck for this webinar as well as the recording. And any questions that we were unable to answer during this time period, we will also provide answers to in the follow-up email. So be on the lookout for that email in the next 24 to 48 hours. And if you don't receive it, feel free to reach out to either Dr. Lewis or I. Our email addresses are here on the screen, and we'll be happy to provide you with a direct email with that information. We had another question about CalPads and if they're having issues with CalPads. Part of what we'll do in the follow-up email is provide you with a link to contacts at CalPads if you're having issues with your CalPads files or you're having issues with CalPads. I would also encourage you to connect with your foster youth foster youth coordinator at the county level if you're having issues with your data, as that individual is prepared to assist you with any problems you may have with your data. Let's see what other questions have come in here.
And I'll just chime in on that, that if you go to the CDE website, they do provide a list of all of the county-based foster youth services coordinating program coordinators. There's a contact list there. So if you haven't kept up to date on who your contact is locally in your county, if you actually just search for foster youth services coordinating program, it should take you to the CDE website where they have an up-to-date contact list by county.
Yes. And I want to thank Bridget Stump for providing a comment here saying that if you are a foster youth services coordinating program person and need assistance with the CalPads 5.7 report or a local match, you may contact the FYSCP TAP team as well. And I think one of those resources that we put in slide number 3, and we're happy to put it as well in the follow-up email, is contact information for the TAP team. So thank you, Bridget, for that information. We appreciate it. Let's see here. Are there any other questions coming in through the webinar? Okay. I see no further questions at this time. So if you have any questions, feel free to email us, please. We're happy to take questions even after the webinar is over, and we'll just respond to you individually if you have anything else that you'd like us to address. I want to thank Dr. Lewis, my colleague here at ERP, for your presentation today. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Debbie again for all of your work and for your support of this work. We are very lucky to be partnering with you and appreciate your time today. Thank you, everybody, for your presentation. Thank you for your time, and have a great afternoon. Bye.
Bye, thank you.